Welcome to PK Soul Romance Audiobooks. Please like, subscribe, and press the bell icon to be notified of new audiobooks every week. And now for the feature presentation Where the River Pauses. Chapter 1: The Stillness Between Storms. Lena Marlowe hadn't cried when she left New York. She hadn't cried when the glossy magazine that bore her name in its byline for almost a decade shut down overnight. Nor had she wept when Nathan, her fiance, her co conspirator in all things urbane and ambitious, slipped his ring back into its velvet box and said, "I think we want different things now." But she cried when she turned onto the winding dirt road that led to her grandmother's cottage in Vermont. The forest swallowed the road, trees arching above like a cathedral of grief. October had already begun to strip the maples of their leaves, scattering them like forgotten letters across the windshield. The sound of tires on gravel was the only thing tethering her to the present moment. And then, there it was, the cottage by the river. Modest, weather worn, and crooked at the edges, like an old book that had been read one too many times. Ivy still clung to the stone chimney. The shutters had faded from time. The porch sagged on one side, as if the house itself had let out a sigh and never quite recovered. She parked the car and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. The river murmured in the distance, low, steady, patient. Her grandmother used to call it the witness. It had seen everything: the Marlowe women laughing over tea, her grandfather's funeral, Lena's childhood summers spent trying to catch fireflies and answers in equal measure. Now it would witness something else: a woman learning how to live after losing everything. She stepped out of the car, the cool air brushing her cheeks like a whispered welcome. The key, still tucked behind the chipped stone frog on the porch, slid into the lock with a reluctant click. The scent of dust and lavender rushed out to meet her. Inside, nothing had changed. The copper kettle still hung above the hearth. Her grandmother's needlepoint pillows still claimed the armchairs. On the windowsill sat a mason jar of smooth pebbles, each one scribbled with a single word in fading ink: grace, mercy. Wait, begin. Lena sank onto the threadbare couch, her overnight bag forgotten at her feet. This was supposed to be temporary, a pause, a breath between the life she had and whatever came next. She would stay a month, maybe two, rest, read, perhaps take a few photographs, and then return to the city, newly assembled. At least that was the plan, if she still believed in plans. On the second day, she found the journal. It was tucked inside the drawer of her grandmother's writing desk, between a half used pad of stationery and a bundle of dried lavender tied with twine. The cover was simple leather, worn soft by years of fingers tracing the edges. There was no title, no lock, no pretense. The first entry was dated 1973. There is something holy in solitude and something terrifying. The world does not prepare us for the ache of silence, but I have begun to believe that the ache is where God lives, or at the very least, where we learn to listen. Lena exhaled, slow and stunned. She read another entry, and then another. Each page was an offering, part reflection, part confession. Her grandmother, whom she remembered as kind but private, had filled entire volumes with thoughts on aging, grief, faith, love, and the way time bent itself differently when you stopped chasing it. She read until dusk folded around the cottage. That night, sleep came in fragments, memories surfacing like leaves in wind: her grandmother's voice, her mother's laughter, the clink of coffee cups in a New York diner, the sharp echo of Nathan's last words. "You used to want more, Lena." But maybe she didn't want more anymore. Maybe she wanted less, but deeper. The next morning, she walked to the river. A narrow path wound through the woods, familiar but changed. Wildflowers grew in forgotten bursts. Mushrooms the color of dusk curled near the base of trees. When she reached the riverbank, the world fell silent. No traffic, no voices, just water threading its way through the stone and root and memory. She took out her camera. The lens felt unfamiliar in her hand, like a part of her past life she wasn't sure she deserved to revisit. Still, she raised it and began to click. Not for an assignment, not for a publication, just because the light fell through the trees in a way that demanded reverence. And that's when she saw him. Across the river, partially hidden behind a grove of birches, stood a man, tall, broad shouldered, dressed in worn jeans and a flannel shirt. He didn't move, just watched her, curious but not unkind. After a few long seconds, he lifted a hand in a slow, deliberate wave. Lena lowered her camera, startled by the contact. She hesitated, then lifted her hand in return. The man nodded once, then disappeared into the trees. She didn't know yet that his name was Gabe Whitaker, or that he was as much a puzzle as she was, a man exiled from his former life, rebuilding something unseen with calloused hands and a philosopher's heart. But she would learn. The river, after all, had already seen it coming. Chapter 2: A Philosophy of Nails and Wood. The man from across the river hadn't been a figment of her imagination. 2 days after their silent exchange among the birch trees, Lena saw him again, this time in the heart of the village, standing just outside the small hardware store that smelled like cedar, linseed oil, and the slow grind of time. He had a sack of nails in one hand and a pair of gloves tucked into his back pocket. He looked like someone used to working with silence, and perhaps too accustomed to solitude. Hello, Lena said before she could second guess herself. He turned toward her, eyes a sharp kind of blue that reminded her of lake ice and cool reason. Not cold, but cautious. I thought I saw you by the river, she added, offering a tentative smile. You did, he said. You're staying at Marlowe's place. She tilted her head, surprised. You knew my grandmother? Everyone around here did, he replied. Marlowe had a way of getting people to say more than they meant to. She once made me cry with a bowl of soup and a single question. Lena laughed, startled by the unexpected warmth in his tone. That sounds like her. I'm Gabe, he said, offering his hand. She took it. His palm was rough, the kind of rough that came from work with real things: wood, stone, metal. Lena, she said. Lena Marlowe. He nodded. I figured. You look like her. The eyes. That caught her off guard. Most people told her she looked like her mother. Sharp angled, city wired. But her grandmother's eyes had been the one thing that always held still, even when everything else in the world shifted. I heard someone bought the old Whitaker house, she said, suddenly aware of the edge in her own voice. Was that you? Gabe nodded. 4 years ago, fixed it up myself. Needed something that wouldn't run away from me. She tilted her head. Curious. Were you running from something? He looked at her then, really looked, quietly, without flinching. Then Lena, who had spent years studying human faces through her camera lens, recognized something ancient behind his expression. Not fear, not sadness. Guilt. Maybe, he said after a pause. Maybe not. Some days it feels like I'm just walking in the other direction. They stood like that for a moment, suspended in a kind of polite stillness, until she remembered the sagging porch back at the cottage. The boards were dangerously loose. The steps leaned inward like they no longer believed in holding anyone up. Do you still do work? She asked. He raised a brow. Work? Carpentry. Repairs. I do. I need someone to fix the porch. It's dangerous, and I have no idea how to swing a hammer without hitting my thumb. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. I can come by tomorrow morning. Take a look. She nodded. Thank you. He turned to leave, but stopped, glancing over his shoulder. Marlowe once told me.
A house that's falling apart is usually just waiting for someone to love it again. He paused. She was usually talking about people. The next morning, he arrived just after 8.
Lena, bleary eyed and still barefoot, opened the door holding a steaming mug of coffee and a half buttoned flannel shirt. The expression on Gabe's face didn't change, but something in the air between them did. An awareness, subtle but undeniable. Coffee? She asked. He held up his own thermos, always prepared. She watched it as he crouched beside the porch, his hands moving over the warped boards like a surgeon diagnosing old wounds. He didn't rush. He didn't fill the silence with unnecessary words.
Looks like water damage over time, he said eventually. Needs a few new beams and support brackets. Nothing I can't handle.
She nodded, grateful.
I'll need to order some lumber, he added. But I can start pulling up the damaged boards today. That okay with you?
Of course. Whatever you need. He returned to his truck, pulled out a toolbox, and began to work. Lena sat on the porch steps with her coffee, watching. The river murmured in the background, a quiet hum, like a voice she hadn't heard in years. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel the need to check her phone, didn't feel the pull of urgency or ambition gnawing at her spine.
Do you miss it? Gabe asked suddenly, not looking up. Miss what?
City life, cameras, all the noise.
She thought for a moment. I miss the illusion of purpose. Deadlines made me feel needed, important, but I think I was chasing something hollow. He nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Philosophers call that teleological dissonance.
Sounds painful. It is, he said, finally glancing at her. It's when your actions no longer align with your soul's purpose, when you're doing things that look good on the outside but feel empty inside.
She looked at him, startled. You were a professor, weren't you? He didn't answer at first, just turned back to his tools. Yes, he said finally, before I stopped pretending the ivory tower was built on anything but sand. There was something in his voice, dry, unsentimental, but not bitter, like a man who had stopped trying to win an argument and simply walked away. What happened? She asked gently. He didn't reply. Instead, he lifted a cracked floorboard, revealing the rot beneath. Some things, he said slowly, don't need retelling, just rebuilding. By noon, the sun had warmed the porch and their silences had begun to feel companionable. She brought him lunch, leftover roasted vegetables and cornbread her grandmother used to make. He took a bite and nodded in approval.
Did you always know how to do this? She asked, watching him replace a bracket with practiced ease.
No, he said. I learned out of necessity. When you lose everything that used to define you, you either fall apart or you build something new. She looked down at her hands. And what if you don't know what to build yet?
He met her gaze. Then you start with the smallest thing, a board, a photograph, a question.
He placed the hammer down and stood up, brushing sawdust from his jeans. I'll be back tomorrow. The porch will be solid by the end of the week. As he walked to his truck, Lena felt something loosen in her chest, something she hadn't realized had clenched so tightly. A memory surfaced, her grandmother's voice quoting Rilke once at the breakfast table.
Live the questions now. Perhaps then, someday, far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer. The porch creaked behind her, half finished, half forgotten, but on its way.
And so, perhaps was she.
Chapter 3. Ghosts Don't Knock.
The first knock came just after sunset. It was the kind of knock that didn't belong in a place like this. Sharp, urgent, breaking the delicate hush that had settled over the cottage. Lena stood in the kitchen, barefoot on the cool tile, her hands sticky with flour from the half kneaded bread dough in the bowl. Outside, the sky had deepened into a dusky rose, and the scent of chimney smoke curled in through the open window. The second knock was louder. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, heart ticking a little faster than she liked. No one came unannounced here. Not in this place where the trees grew like quiet sentinels and the road to the house wound so far off the main street it almost felt like a secret. She pulled open the door. And then time folded in on itself. Nathan? Her voice sounded foreign in her own throat. He stood there, tall, sharp, polished in his camel colored coat and navy scarf. The city still clung to him like cologne. His hair was styled just so, his expression practiced, neutral with a hint of concern, as if he were stepping into a boardroom and not the wreckage he had left behind. Hi, Lena, he said. Can I come in? She stared at him. For a full 10 seconds, all she could hear was the rush of blood in her ears and the distant hush of the river. No, she said finally. I don't think you can. He blinked. Lena, please. I drove 5 hours. Why? She asked, arms crossing instinctively. Bored in Manhattan? Missing your moral compass? He sighed. I deserved that. You deserve more than that, she said, but I'm not in the mood to hand out punishments or closure. Nathan shifted his weight, the first crack in his facade appearing. I heard about the magazine. I was worried about you. Lena looked straight at him. No, you weren't. You were curious. He flinched, and for a second she almost felt sorry for him. She stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind her. The air had cooled. A breeze whispered through the trees, stirring the wind chimes her grandmother had hung decades ago. I'm not who I was, she said quietly. I can see that, he replied. You're different. I'm trying to live differently. Nathan studied her, eyes softening. I miss you, Lena. No, Nathan, she said, shaking her head. You missed the version of me that made you feel more grounded. I was your still point while you chased ambition like a high. You don't miss me. You miss the way I made you feel. He swallowed hard. I was loyal, she continued. Faithful. I built a life around you. And you. Her voice broke, but she forced herself to keep going. You handed our future to someone who looked better in stilettos. His shoulders sagged. It was a mistake. It was a decision, she corrected. And it freed me. I didn't see it then, but I do now. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. Then quietly, you've been talking to someone? She raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? You're different, stronger, clearer. Someone's helped you see yourself. Lena laughed. No, Nathan. That was me. Just me. Out here with a crumbling porch, a river, and the ghosts of women who knew how to survive. He stepped forward, and for a moment she thought he might try to touch her. Her body went rigid. I should go, he said, reading the change in her posture. Yes, she whispered. He turned, walking back down the steps and toward his car. Before he opened the door, he glanced back. I always thought I knew who you were, Lena, but I don't think I ever did. And then he was gone. She stood there for a long time after the sound of his engine faded. That night, sleep came in fragments again. Her dreams were jagged, images of her old apartment, her camera equipment collecting dust, Nathan laughing in a restaurant they used to frequent, his hand on someone else's knee. Then the dreams shifted. She was alone in a river, trying to swim, but the water was too still, like it was holding her in place. She woke just before dawn, heart pounding. She needed air. Wrapping herself in a shawl, she stepped outside. The stars were still out. The river shimmered, dark and alive. She followed the narrow path toward it, drawn by something more than restlessness. Halfway down the path, she saw movement near the tree line. She stilled, and then Gabe stepped into view. a worn lantern in one hand and a tool satchel slung over his shoulder. He looked surprised to see her, but not unsettled. Trouble sleeping? He asked softly. Something like that. He nodded, approaching slowly. Sometimes I come out here to think before the town wakes up. There's something honest about the dark, don't you think?
She studied his face in the low light. He looked tired but steady, like someone who had learned to carry his weariness with grace.
My ex showed up last night, she said.
Gabe didn't react the way most people would have, with questions, with outrage, with concern. Instead, he simply said, "Ah," and let the silence hold the rest. "I told him I was different," she said, more to herself than to him. "But I'm not sure I really am. I still feel like a version of the woman who let herself get small." Gabe sat down on a fallen log, gesturing for her to join him.
You know what Soren Kierkegaard said about becoming oneself? He asked.
She shook her head.
He said, the most common form of despair is not being who you are. She let that sit for a moment. I spent years being a version of someone that fit into a world I no longer want to be part of, she said. And now that I'm free, I'm terrified I don't know who I really am.
Gabe looked at her, not with pity, but with recognition. "That's not despair," he said. "That's the beginning."
A long breath left her lungs. I don't know what this is, Gabe. This place, this porch, you.
"It doesn't have to be anything," he replied. "Not yet. Sometimes the foundation comes before the house. Sometimes you sit with the raw wood and decide what kind of home you want to build." She turned to look at him. Really look.
Have you built your home yet?
He smiled faintly. "I'm still drawing the blueprints."
And in that quiet moment, under the stars, by the river that never stopped moving, Lena realized she had stepped into something more than recovery. She had stepped into possibility.
Chapter 4. The Way the Light Falls. Lena opened her eyes to see sunlight pouring through the linen curtains, slanting golden across the hardwood floor. Outside, birds called gently into the morning, and the trees rustled in a rhythm that sounded almost like breathing. It was the kind of morning her grandmother had always described as sacred.
For the first time in weeks, Lena didn't feel the urge to rush into anything. No inbox waiting, no meetings, no curated social events to pretend she enjoyed. Just the long stretch of a quiet day and the vague memory of a conversation by the river in the pre dawn hours. Gabe's voice calm, philosophical, as if he carried centuries in his chest. She pulled on jeans, an old cotton sweater, and padded barefoot into the kitchen. As the coffee brewed, she thumbed through her grandmother's journal again. A single line on the page caught her eye. There is a kind of light that doesn't just reveal, it heals. She closed the journal gently and looked toward the window. The light today wasn't just beautiful, it felt like permission. Gabe arrived mid morning, toolbox in hand, sleeves rolled to the elbows. Lena found herself watching him longer than necessary. The way he moved, unhurried but precise. There was something meditative in the way he worked, like he wasn't just fixing something, but communing with it.
"You're early," she said, stepping onto the porch with 2 mugs of coffee.
He glanced up from where he knelt, fitting a new support beam. You said the steps were threatening your life. I figured I'd offer a truce on their behalf. She smiled and handed him a mug.
"I thought I might take some photos today," she said as he sipped. "The light's different this morning." He nodded toward the edge of the woods. "It's bouncing off the river in a way it doesn't always do, like the sky tilted just a little."
You notice things, she said, surprised. I used to teach people how to think. It taught me how to see. She tilted her head. What exactly did you teach? He hesitated, then said, Ethics, existentialism. The uncomfortable questions, like,
What does it mean to live a good life? Can a person be both broken and whole? Are we defined by our past or by what we choose to do with the damage?
Lena sat beside him on the step, her camera resting in her lap. Did you ever find answers? He looked at her, a faint smile touching his lips. The day a philosopher claims he has all the answers is the day he is no longer worth listening to. Later that afternoon, Lena asked if Gabe would walk with her to the river. The repairs could wait. The light, they both knew, would not. The forest path was softened with moss and autumn leaves, and the trees filtered the sunlight into lacework patterns on the ground. Lena kept stopping, clicking her camera. Do you always photograph in silence? Gabe asked as they reached the river's edge.
Usually, she said, words get in the way. Images don't lie to me the way people do.
He didn't reply. Instead, he sat on a low boulder and watched her work. She moved like someone finally slipping into her own skin, fluid, instinctive, open. She crouched by the water, snapping a shot of where the light met the current. Then she paused, looked up. You said you lost everything, she said softly. Back then, when you left academia. Gabe didn't flinch. I did.
What happened?
He took a deep breath, then ran a hand through his hair. For a long moment, the river was the only voice between them. There was a student, he said finally. Not what you think, nothing romantic. But she was struggling. Quiet, brilliant, unraveling under pressure. I tried to help, late conversations, office hours that went long, emails back and forth. He looked down. She failed a course she needed, and she didn't take it well. Lena didn't interrupt.
She told the dean I'd manipulated her, that I'd crossed lines I hadn't. There was no proof, no investigation, just whispers, and those are louder than facts in a place like that.
What happened to her? She left school, transferred, I think. Last I heard, she was okay, but by then the damage was done. Lena felt a slow ache settle into her chest. I'm sorry. He shrugged, but his voice was taut. I wasn't innocent. Not because I did what she claimed, but because I stayed in a world that demanded we care deeply and then punished us for it. I thought I could balance truth and policy. I thought I could help without being devoured by the system. He paused. I was wrong. She sat beside him on the grass. Do you miss teaching? I miss the good days when someone's eyes lit up because they understood a question they hadn't even known how to ask. He smiled faintly. But I don't miss defending my humanity to people who only believed in perfection. Lena looked toward the river. I used to think my job made me who I was. And now that it's gone, you feel hollow.
Yes. He turned to face her, his expression serious. Then fill the hollow, Lena, with light, with questions, with moments like this.
They sat there in silence, side by side, the sun sliding lower behind the trees. After a while, Gabe spoke again. Do you know why I really bought that house? She shook her head. Because it had no mirrors, he said. Not one. I figured if I stopped looking for myself in reflections, maybe I'd start finding myself in real things: wood, rivers, people who didn't care about who I used to be. Lena reached for her camera again, but this time she didn't lift it to her eye. She looked at him instead. I want to take your portrait, she said. He raised a brow. Why? Because the way the light falls on you right now, it's not just showing you, it's forgiving you. For a long time, he didn't move. Then slowly he nodded. She lifted the camera, adjusted the lens. As she focused, he looked directly at her. No pose, no mask, just a man who had let himself be seen. She clicked the shutter. And in that single, small sound, something shifted between them. Not loudly, not dramatically, but like the first note of a song that had waited years to be played.
That evening, back in the cottage, Lena downloaded the photos onto her laptop. Her eyes lingered on Gabe's portrait. The angle of his jaw, the softness in his gaze, the truth in his stillness.
Her grandmother's journal lay open beside her. Sometimes healing is not a thunderclap. Sometimes it's the way the light touches a face and says, "You're still here. You're still worth capturing." Lena closed the laptop and leaned back, exhaling slowly. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but today had been real.
Chapter 5. The Courage to Stay. The rain began just after midnight, soft at first, like whispered confessions, then steady. Lena lay awake in bed, listening. She had grown used to the quiet of this place, but something in the storm felt different tonight, purposeful, like it was trying to say something she hadn't yet dared to hear.
Her grandmother used to say that rain wasn't just water, it was memory. And some storms came not to wash the world clean, but to remind you what still needed tending.
Lena pulled the quilt tighter around her and turned over. Tomorrow, she would have to go into town.
And she wasn't sure she was ready. By mid morning, the storm had lightened to a drizzle. Gray clouds rolled across the sky, and the world smelled like pine needles and earth. Lena pulled her hair into a loose knot, slipped on her boots, and gathered a few things for her errands: grocery list, camera bag, and a letter she'd found wedged behind a drawer. An old note from her grandmother addressed to a friend named Ethel. She hadn't meant to read it, but the envelope was already open, and her name was scribbled in the corner, as if the letter had waited years for her to find it. The message inside was short but powerful.
Tell her when the time comes that home is not a place you remember, it's the place that remembers you back. And if she's anything like me, she'll need to be reminded not to run again when things get hard.
Lena folded it and tucked it into her coat pocket. The truth of it stayed with her.
The town felt different today.
Main Street bustled with post storm activity, shopkeepers sweeping puddles off their thresholds, a group of older women with baskets full of late season apples, a young couple laughing beneath a shared umbrella. It should have felt warm, familiar, but it didn't. Something had changed.
When Lena entered the general store, conversations dulled just slightly. Heads turned, smiles were polite but faintly clipped. A woman who had once offered her scones now only nodded before quickly turning away.
She moved through the aisles in a daze, gathering tea, flour, and a new notebook. At the counter, Marla, the owner, usually sweet and chatty, barely looked her in the eye. "Anything else, Miss Marlowe?" she asked.
No, Lena said slowly. That's all. Thank you.
She hesitated before adding, "Is everything all right?" Marla stiffened. "Oh, you know how small towns are. Word travels."
Lena's breath caught.
Word? Marla looked up then. And for the first time, there was something in her eyes Lena hadn't seen before. It was judgment. "You're spending a lot of time with Gabe Whitaker," Marla said flatly. "That tends to raise eyebrows. People remember what happened. We don't forget around here."
Lena swallowed. But what you remember isn't the whole story.
Marla didn't respond. And in that moment, Lena realized just how fragile beginnings were, and how easily they could be poisoned by the shadows of someone else's past. Outside, the air felt colder. She walked the long way back to the cottage, letting the wind sting her cheeks. Her thoughts swirled in sharp fragments. What had she expected? That she could build something new without consequence? That love, or something like it, could grow where mistrust already had roots? She didn't want to see Gabe. Not like this. Not until she had sorted the ache inside her chest. But when she turned the final bend on the trail leading home, she saw him.
He was on the porch, tightening the last beam into place. The steps were finished now. smooth, solid, no longer sagging. He stood up as she approached, brushing sawdust from his hands. "You're back early," he said. "I went into town."
He nodded, studying her face. You heard then? Her jaw clenched. How long have people been talking? He leaned against the railing. 4 years. Quietly, sometimes not so quietly. I kept to myself. Let them talk. And now they're talking about me. He didn't answer. That was answer enough. Lena looked away, the trees blurring through the sting in her eyes. You should have told me, Gabe. Told you what? He said, voice low but steady. That people fear what they don't understand. That truth doesn't always win in small towns. She turned to him. That I'd be choosing more than just you. That I'd be choosing your ghosts too. Gabe's jaw tightened. For a moment, he looked like he might turn away. But then he stepped closer, voice raw.
"I didn't ask you to choose anything, Lena. I'm not a man who gets chosen anymore."
Her heart cracked open then, not because of what he said, but because he believed it. She reached out, her fingers brushing his sleeve. I haven't run yet, she whispered, but I need to know. Can you stay? Not here, physically, but with me. If it gets harder. He met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw the boy he must have been once, the one who believed in ideas before the world taught him that belief could be punished.
"I want to," he said, "but I've forgotten how."
Lena took his hand, calloused, warm, trembling slightly.
"Then we'll remember together." That night, they sat by the fire inside the cottage. The bread she had begun kneading the night before was now warm from the oven. They ate it with honey and shared a bottle of wine her grandmother had kept for special occasions. As the logs crackled and the rain returned, Gabe turned to her. "You asked me once what I'd build if I could start again."
She nodded.
"I think it would be this," he said. "A life where honesty doesn't need defending, where pain isn't hidden like shame, where someone looks at me and doesn't see a warning sign."
Lena leaned her head against his shoulder. And I'd build a life where I no longer measure myself by what I produce, but by how deeply I love, how bravely I stay. The storm roared outside, but inside it was quiet. And in the quiet, two broken people made the decision not to run. They stayed.
Chapter 6. When the River Rises. The river had always murmured, a soft companion whispering beneath the trees. But that morning, it no longer whispered. It roared. Lena stood at the kitchen window, a mug of tea cooling in her hand. Outside, the clouds hung low, stretched tight across the sky like something about to snap. The rain hadn't stopped all night. Now the ground was soaked to saturation, and the river had begun to spill beyond its usual bounds, clawing its way up the banks.
She could feel it, the tension in the air, the kind of pressure that presses against your skin and your thoughts. The cottage, usually her sanctuary, felt suddenly fragile, like a boat in rising water. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Art Life Quarterly, the independent photography journal she had sent samples to weeks ago in a moment of strange, quiet boldness.
She hesitated before opening it.
Lena, we love your work. It's both intimate and expansive, rare. Would love to discuss a full photo essay for our spring issue. Are you available for a call this week? Her fingers trembled. She reread the message 3 times before slowly setting the phone down. Her breath caught somewhere between thrill and dread. It was the kind of offer she'd once dreamed of. A feature spread, editorial freedom, exposure not tied to branding or image or clients. But instead of joy, she felt panic because she didn't know if she wanted to go back. Gabe arrived 2 hours later, soaked to the knees and windblown, his tool bag slung over one shoulder. The backfield's flooding, he said as he stepped onto the porch, wiping water from his brow. And the town's sandbagging near the bridge. You might want to stay in for a few days.
Lena nodded, then held up her phone.
I got offered a feature, she said. He looked at her, brows lifted. That's good, isn't it?
It should be, she exhaled, but I don't know if it is.
Gabe stepped inside, closing the door behind him. You're scared. She gave him a look. That obvious? Not fear of failure, he clarified. Fear of undoing the stillness, the clarity, of losing yourself again in a life you barely survived the first time.
Lena blinked, surprised by the way he always seemed to say the thing she hadn't fully formed inside herself yet.
Yes, she said quietly. That's exactly it. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table, the room dim with stormlight. The windows rattled faintly under the wind's push. You don't owe the world anything, he said. Not another resume, not another performance, not even your art, if offering it means losing yourself again. But if I don't say yes, am I just hiding or healing? She chewed the inside of her cheek. And if I say yes, and it pulls me away from here, away from you? Gabe looked away then, staring at the river outside, swollen and angry. Then we'll figure that out. If it's real, we'll find a way.
But what if you decide I'm not worth the risk? She asked, and her voice broke then quietly. What if you remember that it's easier to be alone?
He turned back to her, eyes burning.
Lena, I remember that every day, and I still choose not to be.
That afternoon, the river rose higher. The town issued an advisory. Back roads were beginning to wash out. Lena lit candles in the cottage just in case the power went, and Gabe hauled sandbags from his truck and began to stack them along the back edge of the property.
By evening, the wind howled, trees bowed. A branch cracked near the kitchen, startling them both. The rain was no longer steady but manic, slanting sideways, relentless.
They ate soup by candlelight, not talking much, the kind of silence that's not empty, but full of shared waiting.
At some point, Lena reached across the table, took Gabe's hand, and squeezed.
I don't want to lose this, she said. You won't, he whispered, unless you walk away.
She paused, searching his face. Would you come with me if I left? If I took the job?
His jaw tightened. I can't go back to that world, Lena. Not even for you. And there it was. The answer she had both needed and feared.
She nodded slowly, not hurt, but thoughtful. Gabe wasn't a man of compromise. He had already rebuilt himself once, and she couldn't ask him to risk it all over again.
She wasn't even sure she should.
That night, the power finally cut out.
They lit more candles and moved the blankets to the living room floor where the fire still glowed with low embers. Outside, the river raged against the banks. Somewhere in the distance, something metallic groaned. Perhaps a tree taking down a power line or a fence post succumbing to the mud. Lena curled beneath the blankets, staring at the ceiling. I used to think storms were just interruptions, she said. Delays, obstacles. Gabe, beside her, murmured, And now? Now I think they're revelations.
He turned toward her, propping himself on one elbow. The fire cast shadows across his face, deepening the lines, softening the corners.
Say more.
She smiled faintly. Storms show you what holds and what breaks, what's rooted and what's just pretending to be.
Gabe brushed a piece of hair from her cheek. And which are you? She turned to face him. I used to think I was fragile. Now I think I was just buried, under expectation, under fear. He leaned closer. You've always been strong, Lena. You just forgot.
I'm remembering. And then she kissed him, slow, tentative, full of all the emotions she hadn't yet dared to speak aloud. It wasn't desperation, it was clarity, a claiming of something real. Here, in the storm, they made love that night as the wind battered the world around them, not as a way to escape, but as a way to anchor. Every movement was careful, reverent, a surrender not just of bodies, but of histories.
And when they finally slept, it was the sleep of the deeply seen. The next morning was eerily still. The storm had passed. Sunlight slipped through broken clouds and fell across the living room floor, puddling at their feet like gold. Lena stood on the porch, wrapped in Gabe's flannel shirt, watching the river recede. The land was soaked, bruised, but intact. She turned to find Gabe watching her. "You made it through," he said. We both did. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. The message from Art Life Quarterly still glowed on the screen. She hit reply. "Thank you for your kind words. I would love to talk more. I just need a few days to decide where home is now." And with that, she tucked the phone away. The river had risen, and she was still here.
Chapter 7. Where the River Pauses. The last of the floodwater had receded. Mud clung to the banks, the grass bowed beneath the weight of surviving. Branches littered the path like forgotten intentions. The air smelled of wet earth and pine bark, cleansed but not erased. Lena stood at the river's edge, barefoot in the cool morning. A mist rose from the water, delicate as lace, curling around her ankles and drifting upward like breath. Her camera hung around her neck, but she hadn't yet raised it.
For once, she didn't need to document the moment. She needed to feel it. Behind her, the cottage exhaled in its own way. Windows cracked open, fresh sheets airing in the sun, the wooden porch newly mended and glowing with oil. Everything was quieter now. The house, the river, even her thoughts. A week had passed since the storm. The world had slowed again. But something inside her had shifted permanently. And now she had a choice to make. Later that morning, she found Gabe in his workshop. The space was part garage, part sanctuary. Wood beams lined the ceiling. Hand tools hung in perfect rows. A half built bookshelf stood in the center, curved at the top like a cathedral arch. He looked up as she entered, wiping sawdust from his hands, a question already in his eyes. "I got a second message," she said. "They offered a travel stipend and a small grant. They want the photo essay in spring. Full creative freedom, rural life, solitude, resilience." "That's good," Gabe said, but his voice was careful, guarded. "I haven't said yes." He studied her. "Why not?"
She crossed the room, her steps slow but sure. "Because part of me is afraid it's just another form of running, another new beginning I haven't earned." He shook his head. "You've earned everything, Lena, but I won't follow you to New York, or Paris, or wherever the next opportunity takes you. I've built a life here with my hands. I need stillness. I can't go back into motion."
She nodded. "I'm not asking you to." They stood in the silence that had always spoken louder between them than words. "I love you," she said softly. It was the first time either of them had said it. Gabe's eyes didn't widen. They gentled, like water easing over stone. "You're sure?"
"No," she said, smiling faintly. "But I've stopped waiting for certainty to feel like safety. Love isn't a promise I'll never change. It's a promise I'll stay when I do."
He stepped forward then, placing a hand against her cheek. "I love you too." Quietly, steadily, like the way the river moves when no one's looking. She closed her eyes and leaned into the touch. "Then let's figure out what this means." They sat on the porch that evening, side by side, watching the sun melt into the trees. She told him about the idea taking shape in her mind. A photo essay not just about country life, but about him, about truth and shame, and the way someone can rebuild dignity from the raw bones of a storm.
"You'd be anonymous," she said, "if you want to be."
"I don't," Gabe said. "Let them see me. If they're going to look, let them see all of me."
She smiled, proud.
"I want to keep the cottage," she added. "Come back and forth, Follow the work when it's right. Stay when I need to. Build something not just out there, but here.
You want both, he said, with wonder but no judgment. I finally believe I deserve both.
He reached for her hand, laced his fingers through hers. Then we'll make a life that holds both. As the light faded, Lena rose and fetched her camera. The evening was honey-colored, draping the land in warmth. The river had calmed to a gentle whisper again. It moved with a kind of knowing, as if it had waited for this all along. She turned to Gabe. Come stand by the water. He did, obedient and smiling, arms loose at his sides. She raised her camera, adjusted the settings, focused on the curve of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the stillness in his stance. Click. The shutter sounded like truth, and she joined him. They stood side by side at the edge of the river. She reached down, scooped a smooth stone from the shore. Cool, round, familiar. She handed it to him. What's this? He asked. A tradition. He turned it in his palm. What do I do with it?
You name what you're choosing to let go of, she said, then throw it into the river. Gabe stared at the stone for a long time. Then he whispered, Shame, and cast it into the current.
It skipped once, then sank. She bent down, chose her own, closed her eyes, whispered, Fear, and let it fly. The water swallowed both stones without protest, without drama.
As if it had been waiting.
1 year later, the spring issue of Art Life Quarterly arrived on the shelves with a cover photo of Gabe standing in profile, golden light behind him, the river blurred in the distance. The title, Stillness and Strength, The Quiet Rebuilding of a Life. Lena's name was printed beneath the essay in clean serif font.
She was there when the first issue came in the mail, her feet up on the newly polished porch, the sun warming her knees. Gabe brought it to her in silence, and they read it together.
When they were finished, he folded the cover closed and said, You told the truth. She looked at him. So did you.
And then they sat, holding hands, as the river whispered its ancient lullaby behind them.
Not rushing, not chasing, just pausing, long enough to know they had arrived.